Okay.
There you go. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I know you have a rigorous schedule all week long. And as Elizabeth just said, there's a hard stop at 9:30 because you're running into meetings and continuing your workday. So we're very appreciative that you're taking the time out to chat with us tonight. I wanted to start off with a personal, connection for me, for Rabbi Sachs. And I think that some of the participants joining us tonight will also share in this idea that my preferred siddur when I go to grab a siddur from the bookshelf is the Koran, and I have multiple volumes of Rabbi Sachs writing on my bookshelf, but my most current and constant connection to Rabbi Sachs' legacy is reading his weekly commentary in the Torah Tidbits. In the months after his passing, as I continued to read his thoughts on the weekly Parsha, I could not help being astounded by how prolific a writer he was. His website boasts, like 50 odd books. And in his Celebrating Life book, he mentions that he would give on average, more than 200 speeches a year. This to me is mind blowing. So I'm curious about his writing process. In his clearly fully booked schedule, how did he manage to find time to do this, make time to do this? And how much did he devote to writing? How much of his time did he devote to writing? What was his process like? And the last part of my question, this first question is, are there any yet unpublished materials that we can look forward to? So there's a mouthful there, but
thank you, Teresa. I will try and answer all of those questions. So Rabbi Sachs was probably the most organized person that I've ever met. And considering my mother and my grandmother were pretty much organized and had everything down to a T from their lists, that's saying something. He had a schedule that he carved himself out time for everything every day. And that included reading. As I said to Therese when we spoke earlier, he didn't sleep very much. So he really focused a lot of his time on his reading and his preparation. He didn't have researchers to do his work for him. And what he would tend to do is whatever it was that he was writing, he would read everything he possibly could around the subject before he started writing. And generally, he used to tell us that he was writing a book to answer a question that he had. And he said, I'm very sorry to the poor people that are reading a 300-page book to answer a question that I'm struggling with. But he often found that was a good basis for writing a book. What was the question? What was the problem at the heart of the issue? And writing a book would help him to express the answer to that problem. But in terms of his schedule, obviously, whilst he was chief rabbi, he had a packed schedule, and you heard he could speak several hundred times during the course of a year. Probably 200 was probably on the low side. I'd probably estimate that was more, because sometimes when we came to Netanya in 2013, that schedule probably had him speaking over 4 days, 30 times. So it's punishing and it's hard work. But when he became chief rabbi, one of the first things he said to them was, I'm a better person when I write. So what he built into his contract was 6 weeks every year in the summer. And from the beginning of July to the beginning of September, that was carved out writing time that was non-negotiable. And he did the same in the winter for about 3 weeks. And that was how he was incredibly prolific. But on top of the books was his regular writing, Covenants and Conversation, which he'd been writing since 2005. And that was his prime time was morning. That's when he felt the freshest, and that was precious time to him. And we knew, we worked very closely together on the diary and carved out those times that he needed to, number one, to write any articles and Covenants Conversation, but also if he was writing an op-ed or to write his speeches and his lectures, that all needed a great deal of time for him to think things through. And I would always, work with him very closely on who was his audience. because you have to know who you're writing for or who you're speaking
Who
to.
you're talking to, right?
Before you start writing anything, and start preparing. And one of his premises was that he wasn't an off the peg person. He was tailor-made. So what that meant was that whoever his audience was, he was speaking to them, and whatever he wrote, whatever lecture he gave, was tailored to their needs. So he would want to know, what are the things that are on their minds at the moment? How could he help them think something difficult through? What was their community going through? He'd always speak to the rabbi or the organizer's head before I would do a lot of the back work beforehand, but he would always want to speak to them, find out what was on their mind, and also who was in the audience. Could they, did he need to explain Jewish words? He was very, very attuned, and the preparation that goes into delivering something like that is enormous. And generally, when you heard him speak, people said, "Oh, it's amazing. He can speak off the cuff. You've no idea how much work went into everything he delivered." Hours and hours of preparation. And whether it was a Zoom across the world, or whether it was people around his dining room table, or 1,000 people lecture, he put so much effort into everything that every bit of output you saw had an awful lot of work put into it. And I'll tell you a funny story. I called him one summer and I said to him, your rabbi is going to be away over the summer, and there's 2 Shabbatot, he's not going to be in shul. Could he put you down to deliver the drasha one week? And he said to me, "Joanna, I never go to shul on a Shabbat morning without a sermon in my pocket." So even if he didn't know that he was going to be asked to speak, he would be prepared.
He was prepared. Wow. You know what? I don't know if other people do this. You're probably going to think I'm a little crazy, but I have been collecting, I cut these out from the Torah tidbits, and I've been collecting these for years. I have them in little piles all over the place because I love going back and looking at them. This one, he wrote on Parashat Bo, and I think it's Parashat Re'eh. And he talks about how Judaism is different from other religions because culturally, while we talk about when we understand something, we say, "Oh, I see. I understand." When we understand something, I see it. But in Judaism, it's about hearing. And he talks about the importance of listening. And it's one of the most powerful, Torah talks that I've ever read. I read it over and over again because it's so beautiful. He clearly he believed deeply in investing the time in not talking, but listening to everybody else. Yet at the same time, he was this illustrious figure. The Prince of Wales, now the King of England, famously called him, not only among Jews, but among non-Jews. He famously called him a light unto this nation, a steadfast friend, a valued advisor. With such successful and illustrious achievements, what was he like as a boss? How did he treat you as an individual? Did he listen to you and your colleagues in the way that he professed to,
Absolutely. And listening was his way of learning as well. He felt that any conversations that he had, and this is why we call it covenant conversation, because he felt the covenant was with God. So we're learning from God, and we're from Hashem, and we're learning the covenant is between us and Hashem. But the conversation is taking Hashem's word to the next generation. And those conversations develop our understanding and our learning. And he learned from every single conversation that he had, whoever it was with. This is how he learned. And listening to him was an absolutely imperative part of being a leader. You had to hear other people's problems, other people's issues, and you had to actually listen very carefully, because often it wasn't obvious until you listened beneath the message. So that deep listening was something that he built into his everyday life. And he would often pick up a nuance in our voices and pick up that there was something wrong or that we were concerned about something. He was always very, very attuned to that. And he would also ask our opinion. So on a constant basis, he'd call us up and discuss something with us. And then he said, "Do you hear me, guys? Does it make sense? Do other people understand it? And I have to tell you, after every Shabbat, he'd call up if he was speaking in shul, and he'd say, "What's the feedback? Did it fall on good ears? Did people understand what I had to say? Can I make it any better next time?" He was always learning from those experiences and learning and growing. And he felt that listening was a very, very important part of his life, but he never stopped. It was always, the listening was part of learning and growing. And so how could he do things better? And I'll tell you one story. I wasn't there, but it's a famous story within our team. He spoke at APAC. And APAC has
DC, in Washington,
in Washington DC, and they have thousands and thousands. It's for the Jewish community, but
that's
also
a huge every year
conference. And that particular year was so enormous that that lunch was being served in 2 different rooms because they couldn't accommodate everyone in one room. And when he spoke the first time, people were still eating and their cutlery, and he came out there and says, "Guys, I didn't reach my audience here." And on the way, walking to the next speaking engagement, the next lunch that he was speaking at, he tweaked it because he thought there are certain things that haven't reached the audience properly. And it's one of the most watched videos on APAC's website.
Wow. Amazing.
But it's just being that attuned to your audience to know how to adapt and adjust accordingly.
You said something a few sentences back about the idea of listening being a way to connect to the next generation. I want to go backwards a little bit. On his Wikipedia page, there's a couple of little fun facts that I found absolutely fascinating. One of the quotes said, Rabbi Sacks says that my father did not have much Jewish education.
He left
and I'm so curious about this because it's clearly an important detail. It's included.
Yeah. So it's something that he came back to again and again and again about the importance of Jewish education. And it was something that filled him with concern for Jewish communities worldwide. And he himself went to non-Jewish schools because I don't think there was much in the way of Jewish education locally in London at that time. There was maybe, but they couldn't get him any further. He was at school locally to himself. But he learned to be, one of the few Jewish boys in his class and stand up for what he believed in. He started the debating society. They didn't have anybody to come in and lead the Jewish society. So he and his friends did at age, 14, 15, 16. So he was already speaking then. But the fact that his father didn't have a good Jewish education always spurred his father on to make sure his children did. And they went, and there's a famous story. Rabbi Sacks would walk to shul with his father on a Shabbos morning, and he'd say to him, he'd ask him, and you can imagine Rabbi Sacks, peppering him with questions about this, that, and the other, and mostly Jewish aspects of after they'd left shul. And his father famously said to him, "Jonathan, I don't have the answers, but one day you'll tell me the answers."
Aw, that's so beautiful. Wow. What his journey to becoming a rabbi wasn't, I think, something that he planned. What made him decide to go in that direction? I'd love to hear your take on that whole trajectory.
So it's very interesting. I think that everybody knows his story about his various meetings with the Lubavitcher Rebbe,
Rabbi Schneerson,
Rabbi Schneerson, and he went to see. He took himself on a journey around America in 1968 on a Greyhound bus ticket, which is not something that you really want to do, to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he very often said, "I wouldn't recommend anyone do it." But that was, he didn't have the money to fly or to go in any other way. And he went to visit various people, and he was, he says he was lucky enough, and I'm sure there were various people telling him that telling the Lubavitcher Rebbe this was someone they needed to meet with. this was something he needed to meet. And he challenged Rabbi Sacks. So Rabbi Sacks was going down the philosophical route.
Yeah,
He was going to be a philosopher.
right.
He was thinking about studying for law, perhaps to be an economist. And he was going down various different routes and wasn't exactly sure. And Lubavitcher Rebbe really challenged him to think about where he was going. He said to him, how many students are there in Cambridge? Oh, Jewish students in Cambridge, possibly about 1,000. And how many are engaged? 100. Well, what are you doing about the rest of them? And it was like, well, the position in which I find myself, which he laughed about. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, you don't find yourself in a position, you put yourself in a position. So if you found yourself in this position, you can put yourself in another position. And he really challenged him to look at, what was going on in the Jewish society in Cambridge and how could he make things better on campus. And that was actually a lifelong passion of his. And it got him very, very upset in later years to see what was going on campus, because he felt that this was an environment where Jews should be free to learn and be with one another, and free to practice their Judaism and not hide it. It really bothered him. And he tried, whenever we went to visit different universities, he would speak to the presidents and say, what are you doing about anti-Semitism on campus? And they, he was called in on several occasions to try and help, sort things out. But it's an upward
challenge. Yeah. So would you say that? So I'm like all of us, I'm sure he changed over time. What were the influences that caused him to change, or that created that trajectory of change for him?
I think one of the things that, and I think a lot of people changed at that time was in 1967. And he talks a lot about how people were following what was going on in Israel, and people became very much more aware of being part of a Jewish community that was worried about their family in Israel, and their family in the broadest sense, not just their personal family, but and it really concerned him, and people became more proud to be Jewish. People started wearing kippah on the street, and at work, which they never had done.
In London.
In London, they became much more proud of being Jewish, and I think there was a sense of wanting to be part of this feeling, and that's what started his journey. That led to his visit to America and seeking out Rav Soloveitchik and the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Lam and various others at that point in time. And each of them, and if you think about it, I think he was 19, I think at the time, 20. 68, he was 20. He was born in 1948. He was 20, and he was young, and yet these seriously, big Gedolim made time to see him. And you have to think that there was a very good reason why they were seeing him. They saw something in him, and one, I think he saw Rabbi Lam fairly early on, and I'm pretty sure it was Rabbi Lam who recommended to the others that they needed to see this young man. This was someone they needed to watch.
Wow, he must have been impressive even at that age.
Yeah, and I
even
think
at a young age.
Yeah. And I recently was talking to his brother, and I didn't realize, because I wasn't on the scene at this time, but apparently he shut himself away almost for 7 years to learn. And he had a family. He was
already
married, and he just had to focus on his learning. So what most people cover in a lifetime, he did in something like 7 years. And this was a lot of it was self-taught. He had Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who was a huge influence on his life, and was based in London at the time, but he put an awful lot of effort into developing and growing himself and his learning, because he didn't come from a family of deep yeshiva learning. This was, he really worked on himself. And this was a story of his life. Every part of his life was developing and growing.
So his primary religious influences happened in that period of time, or just throughout his lifetime?
I think throughout his lifetimes, different people have influenced him in different ways, but that
first
America, really influenced him.
What other religious influences could you name, or were there any that stand out?
Rav Nachum was incredibly influential on him. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein also. And there were various people that he would contact and speak to over time, and he developed very, very good relationships with rabbinic peers, whose opinion he sought and advice he got. So but as I say, he learned from everybody. But
he was a listener,
he was
even non-Jews, and secular
absolutely.
Jews. The famous story of talking to Amos Oz and
exactly Fania Oz and various others.
What would you say was his attitude toward the modern state of Israel and his feelings about its place in the world? What was his relationship with Israel like?
He absolutely loved the state of Israel, and they bought a flat a few years ago, and so he felt that he really had roots there. His brothers all live there, and he visited as often as he possibly could. But he also felt that the relationship between the diaspora and Israel was very important, and that that diaspora Jews are going to be here for a long time, and it was very important that we work together. So he would whenever we were in Israel, he would engage with various leaders in Israel and work with them to develop projects and bring ideas back to the UK. But he felt that it was very, very important to work together.
With the change of attitude toward Israel and the development of increase in anti-Zionism, did he also see that as anti-Semitism? What were his?
Yes, he very much so. And we've got some whiteboard animation videos that he did on, I can't remember the exact title of it now, but he talks about how anti-Zionism very much was anti-Semitism. And you could couch it in other language, but it was very much something that was people felt it was sort of not exactly anti-Semitism, but he felt it was very much so.
Very much, yeah. How did he address anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli sentiment? What was his approach?
So he wrote a lot about it. He also he went to the European Parliament and delivered a very important lecture in about 2014, 2015, where he said, this is where it all began. Are you allowing this to happen again? So it was a very, very hard-hitting speach.
He wasn't shy about
absolutely not
bringing
calling
up the past.
Absolutely. Yes. And actually we've got a whiteboard animation video on anti-Semitism, which has been used by non-Jews and secular schools to explain the virus, which is anti-Semitism. It's very clear, it's quite short and concise, but because you've got the visual explanation and his voice, it explains this is a virus that mutates through generations, and it's very difficult to get rid of it.
Wow.
And people don't like to admit they're anti-Semitic. It's Israel. I just don't like the state of Israel, but actually it comes down to anti-Semitism every time.
Yeah, I know. And it's a difficult thing to address. I'm certain that however he managed to do it, it was probably very powerful. Can you tell us about the Rabbi Sacks legacy, how it began? You're muted, or something happened. You're muted, Joanna.
Yeah, I've got it back.
Okay.
Sorry, there was a bit of background noise for a moment, so I muted myself, but I couldn't unmute. So the Rabbi Sacks legacy was, we've had the Covenant of Conversation Trust. It was established when he stepped down as chief rabbi in 2013. And after he passed away, there was a period of time when we had to do a lot of thinking and planning. As I'm sure you're aware, we didn't know that he was ill. So we had very, very little time. We didn't have any time to ask him for what he felt his legacy should be. There was 3-4 weeks.
Wow.
So
I didn't realize that.
We didn't discuss it. It wasn't on the cards. It wasn't remotely on the cards. It was not even something that we thought about in our distant minds. It was, he was going to get better. So so it took us a while after the Shloshim to start thinking about what the legacy might look like, and we transitioned from the Covenant and Conversation Trust to the Rabbi Sachs Legacy, and that was in early January 2021. We invited the family to join the board, which we had not done before. Rabbi Sachs's express wish is that he protected his family, and he didn't feel that they needed to be burdened with the things that he was doing as that he was doing around the world. But we felt that it was very important to have their input and their guidance and their encouragement for what the legacy looked like.
So who from his family is involved?
So his wife Elaine is on the board, his brother Alan, and
who's here in Israel.
Yeah, two of his children. So it's in London, the board. But his wife lives in London, two of his children, Joshua and Gila, and his son-in-law Elliot is our chair. And then we have several other board members. It's a global board, so we have from Israel Daniel Taub, we have Michal Kotler, who are two of our trustees from Israel. We've got American trustees. And then we're very privileged to have some really special people like Lord Daniel Finkelstein, a wonderful gentleman, long-standing friend of Rabbi Sachs called Stuart Roden. It's a very very good group, and we've been it took us time to think about what the legacy might look like, and we sort of come to realize that there are three pillars of work that we need to focus on. One is publications. Making sure that all his books are in print, because some of the books that you see on our website have been out of print for several years, and that's a project that we're working on to bring them back into print. Corinne are very much helping us with that in Israel. And then making sure that our website is fully searchable, so that it is a really good archive of Rabbi Sachs's work, everything that he spoke, wrote, and delivered in his lifetime, all the articles, Thought for the Days, Credo, that people like to access, everything's available. We're also translating into various different languages. So now you'll find on our website, when you go to Covenant Conversation, we're translating into almost 10 languages every week.
Wow.
And so
there's an audience for that.
There is an audience for that, which is
amazing?
Quite amazing. So that's the publications and the website. Then education is something that was very dear to Rabbi Sachs's heart. He really believed that we could educate our youngsters to have a love of their Judaism, of their Yiddishkeit, and really understand it. Do what you're doing from a point of knowledge. And not just teaching them by example, but actually teaching them why we do things and how we do things, and giving them a love of Yiddishkeit, enjoying being in shul. That's why music was so important to him. So how do we engage that next generation? Training the teachers, taking curriculum into schools, working with university students. In Israel, we're working with Mechinot and various different school organizations. So really building that education.
The multi-pronged operation. There's a lot of pieces to it.
There are a lot of pieces, and the final pillar is leadership. I think he was, what I would call your model example of what a Jewish leader should be. And how can we help upcoming leaders to achieve their potential and beyond?
Wow. That sounds like a daunting responsibility. So changing the attack slightly, can you tell us something about Rabbi Sachs that no one else would know?
So those at McDonald's probably will remember his visit in 2013. We accompanied the Shabbaton choir around Israel, and one of the passions of Rabbi Sachs's life was music, and he strongly believed that music takes us on a spiritual journey, and he felt that particularly in shul and elsewhere, this could have such a huge impact on our lives. But what not everybody knows is that he had a deep love of music of every genre. From one extreme to the other. I remember walking out of the BBC Thought for the Day studio with him one morning, and the producer stopped us on our way out, and she walked us out, and she said, "Rabbi Sachs, I hear that you like Eminem? Would you like to do a program on rap? And he said, I don't think so. But she'd heard that and when we were in the car on the way home, he said, Joanna, have you heard? And I can't remember the name of the song because it's not exactly my flavor of music. And I hadn't. And when we got back to his house, he made me come and listen to the song. But one of my funniest stories is it was early on in my days in the chief rabbi's office, and I must have been fixing his computer at home, and my phone is normally on silent and it wasn't, and my ringtone at that point was Bohemian Rhapsody from Queen. And it blared out across the office, and he looked up and I looked up, and I turned my phone off, and he said, Joanna, do you like Queen? And I said, Chief Rabbi, you know that's Queen? And we were both roaring with laughter. I think we both learned a lot about one another from that episode. But he loved the Beatles. He loved, but then he loved Brahms and Mozart, and from one extreme to the other, and all Jewish music in between. But he always wanted to know, why was that piece of music written? How was it put together? He then gave me a share on Bohemian Rhapsody and how that was put together. And it was overdubbed 70 something times. Well, I didn't know that. It was incredible. He wanted to know, what was the story beneath the music? Why has Eminem written what he had written? It was a difficult song. Leonard Cohen, he loved, and he did a video on it from that week's Parsha that Leonard Cohen had passed away. He saw something in music that touched him and lifted him in difficult times of his life, but just generally, it was something that was very precious.
Wonderful. That will stick with me. Hang on a second. I'm just going back over my questions. His work was not only about Torah or spiritual or intellectual insights. He often wrote inspiringly and powerfully about human relationships and the societal developments and political changes. What were some of the publications that he would turn to stay abreast and remain informed of what was taking place in our world with regard to cultural climates?
So he was an avid reader of, just like he loved all kinds of music, he read everything. And he would, before he wrote anything or before he was speaking to an audience, he would read around that subject to make sure that he was fully abreast of current events and he'd constantly ask us. And one of my challenges when you get into the car going to the Thought for the Day studio in the morning, you get in the car at 7 a.m. and you've got about a 20-minute journey to BBC studios, and I would read the papers before I got in the car to see if there was something I could tell him new that he hadn't seen yet, because
wow,
he read the papers, he read op-eds, he was constantly online looking at news and finding out what was going on. He was constantly interested in what was going on in the world, and we would discuss current events and
from every perspective.
Absolutely.
Did he follow any social media?
He didn't do social media, we did it for him.
So what was that like?
We checked everything that we put up, but he trusted us. We did, we could speak in his voice whilst he was live, and he'd often say, I think I do Facebook. But one of the things that he trusted us was to try new things, and he saw information technology and the developments in social media as a way of reaching new audiences. So he wasn't scared. He was very, very concerned about the problems that social media brought, and he talked a lot about narrow casting and only listening to people that are saying the same things that you want to hear and not giving you the breadth. But that's why he didn't, he read the Times, but he also would dip into the Guardian, which is not the kind of reading you really want to read in the UK. It's very left-leaning and has very extreme views, but it was important for him to hear every kind of message and not just limit himself. He warned about the dangers of narrow casting all the time. He said that's how you create extremes.
Yeah, in his TED talk, which I also love. He mentions that exactly, that it's, because we're, he's alone together, that we're all, because of the algorithms and the way that social media functions, he said, you're in an echo chamber.
Yes.
You're hearing exactly the only single opinion, this narrow opinion that, that you're, drawn to, and you don't know what other people around the world or even your next door neighbor is saying or thinking.
Exactly.
So it's, I'm not surprised to hear you say that, that he was really curious and wanted to read everything, and really listen and find out what was going on in an earnest way. So I'm not surprised. Let me see here. So he quotes Elie Wiesel on in one of his Torah talks, saying that God created man because God loves stories. So you've already shared, quite a few, but can you tell us something, a story about Rabbi Sacks that indicates something about the kind of person that he was, something that we don't know?
So I went with him. You just mentioned the TED talk, and I went with him to the rehearsal for TED. TED make you prepare extremely. They want excellent.
No notes. You got to do the whole thing from memory.
No, nothing. Everything's in your memory. And Rabbi Sacks has been delivering sermons of 18 minutes for as long as I've known him and beyond, because he felt that 18 minutes, which is the length of a TED talk, is the perfect length. You lose people after that 18 minutes. So he was always he could always make a point and speak in a very succinct way, but where you had an amazing takeaway from that message. But I went with him to TED, and there are a couple of things which sort of make me smile. On the journey there, he saw that I was listening or watching a video on my computer, and he said, "Oh, what's that?" So I said, that TED have sent lots of explanations of how to do things and how they recommend you stand and you walk and you hold your hands. And he said, "Can I watch it?" So I said, "Absolutely not." So he said, "Why not?" I said, "Because you're natural and you do it without thinking. And if you start doing this, you're going to start thinking, oh, should I hold my hands here?" And he thought it was quite, but for people who weren't familiar with being on stage, it was giving them tips and tools to but then when he actually went to do a practice run for TED, we had to go and listen to somebody else practicing. That's what they ask you to do. Come and watch someone else practicing. So you get tips and ideas from someone else's preparatory talk. Anyway, he heard Ted Dalio, I think is his name. He was what at that point was the biggest hedge fund owner in the world.
Okay.
And he spoke for 19 minutes with lots of notes because it was a practice, and they gave him 25 minutes worth of feedback. It was painful to watch. And then Rabbi Sacks came up, and we were a bit nervous because, what are they going to do to him? He was pitch perfect because he'd probably written his TED talk 20 plus times. It was beautiful, and it was answering the question of the TED conference, which was the future you. So it was speaking exactly to their message, which is exactly what he would do. But to TED, it was, it was just incredible. And he came off the stage and they said, "Rabbi Sacks, don't change a word." Anything. So he looked at them and he said, "But," and Chris Anderson, who's the curator of TED, said, "Is there any chance that you might lose the tie?" And so Rabbi Sacks,
his necktie.
So the instructions from TED on dress code, because they don't leave anything to chance, is, be comfortable with what you're wearing on stage, be who you are. And so he said to Chris, he said, "Look, this is who I am. I'm not going to lose the tie, but I promise you I'll stick to the rest of the dress code and I won't wear any dangling earrings." And the room just erupted. And he says, "Okay, keep the tie."
Yeah, no, he does wear a tie in the TED talk.
Absolutely, because that's who he is.
Yeah.
So,
now he wouldn't have looked right without it.
No, exactly.
No, that's a great story. I love it. Do you have another one for us?
So I took my daughter for her birthday to, I'm sure you've heard of Downton Abbey.
Oh,
so
sure.
So we went to Highclere Castle because we're all huge Downton Abbey fans. And on my way back, Rabbi Sachs called me and he said, oh, where have you been? Have you been anywhere nice? I think it was a bank holiday. And so I said, actually, yes, I've just taken Rivka to see Highclere Castle. And he launched into the most incredible sort of sheer on Tutankhamun's tomb. And there was a huge exhibition underneath Highclere Castle, because the owner of Highclere, this was her passion, on mummies and tombs, and Tutankhamun in particular, I think it was. And I spoke, it's not something he could have looked up, or he didn't know that I was going there. And he had this incredible knowledge of everything. You know, you asked me, did he read around topics and what did he was interested and curious about everything. And so he said, did you go and visit the exhibition? Thank God we had. But it was extraordinary. It was absolutely extraordinary. This is just who he was. And then, you know, I've got, you know, the way he was with my family was absolutely phenomenal. He officiated, was Masada Kedushin at my daughter Rashi's wedding, and he spoke to them beautifully under the chuppah. It was extraordinarily special. And we also, when he stepped down as chief rabbi, he moved around the corner from us. So when he was chief rabbi, he was in Hamilton Terrace, which is the residence of the chief rabbi, on the way to central London. But he moved. So
you live near each other.
So he moved closer to us when he stepped down, and we were honored to host him for Sukkot meals. That became our chazaka, and it was just,
I'm so jealous. What wonderful stories you've shared with us. We have a few questions, and I'd like to we're not really opening the floor. I'm going to invite Melissa to share some of the questions that have been posted in the chat with us, and perhaps we can respond.
I want to say these are great questions, so we'll give them to you, Joanna, in order and ask you to speak to them. Can you speak about the Genesis Prize?
So Rabbi Sachs actually was awarded it was an award from Genesis. He didn't get the Genesis Prize itself. So it was actually awarded posthumously. And he received it, Elaine received it on his behalf a year after he passed away. So actually it was October 21, which was a huge honor for the family, for him to receive that, but he wasn't aware that he'd received it.
Someone did ask about how he found time to sleep, and you did say right at the beginning that he didn't. So there was that. Okay. How is the legacy funded?
That's an excellent question. So at the moment, it's being funded by individual donations. We have a group of core funders. We are always soliciting, we're always fundraising for the next activity that we want to do in his memory. We have some key relationships with foundations in the States, but it's fundraising is not a fun job. But thank God we have, you know, a very pure and wonderful brand, if I could say that, who well respected, and people really want to get behind us and support the work that we're doing.
For sure. What do you think would be his message to us today?
I can't speak for Rabbi Sachs, but I think I asked myself so many times, and so many others do, and we've discussed it within the family as well. You know, I think he would have so much to say at the moment. He never ever got involved in political discussions, and he would have found a way to make a contribution today that stayed above the parapet. And I think the importance of listening to one another is such an important message for all of us. And hearing the other side of the story and sharing. We are also, you know, Am Yisrael, we should be one family. I think he felt very strongly that the damage that Jews do to one another is often done from within. No one can hurt us like we can hurt ourselves. But he would have had hope. He always felt, that's why he wore a yellow tie, to bring light and hope into the world. And I think, you know, he would have really been hopeful that we would see a way forward out of the problems that we're all going through at the moment, and that there has to be a light at the end of the tunnel. So I hope that's something that he would have spoken to us about.
Would it be possible to speak about how Rabbi Sacks and the king's relationship developed?
So that was they were friends for many years, and I found a picture not long ago from about 30 years ago, both looking considerably younger. And they were both born in the same year as the king has talked about, you know, born in 1948, the year of the creation of the state of Israel. And he famously, Therese spoke, you know, that gave the quote that he gave at Rabbi Sacks's retirement dinner, which we said, we in our briefing note, we said he's not retiring, he's just stepping down as chief rabbi. And so the king made a joke of that, and they had this fabulous relationship. And you know, when he heard he wasn't well, he wrote a beautiful letter, and he was very, very, very lovely to Elaine before and after Rabbi Sacks passed away. It was very special. He sought his advice and guidance. He'd often ask him for advice on a certain speech that he would be giving, you know, thinking about a particular topic. But I think there were a lot of things that they both believed in, and they both felt that they were very much on the same wavelength.
Thank you. Joanna, on behalf of McDonald Shul and those of us who are listening, we want to thank you very, very much for taking the time. You've given us a three-dimensional background picture of Rabbi Sacks that, at least for me, will really enrich as we read his writings. Now we have this picture of the man behind the writing, which has just been fantastic that you've been able to do this in 1 hour. Therese, thank you very much. Your questions were so illuminating and brought out the warmth, enabled Joanna to speak to the warmth of Rabbi Sacks. So thank you all very, very much. Wish you well. Wish you a good evening.
If we were in a real room, there'd be applause.
Would be applause, but I've shut off everybody's video and you can't see anybody applauding. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending. And this will be recorded and then put up on our McDonald Shul website in due time, maybe next week. Bye, everybody.